We know that the US has one of the highest maternal mortality rates among developed nations, and 2/3 of those deaths happen after birth. They happen in postpartum. And so right when complications following birth are, I would guess, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but at their highest is right when care starts to taper off for the birthing person. The ultimate reason that we discovered postpartum preeclampsia was I was my own advocate. I was like, something's off, something's not right, I'm not feeling well. I was not having typical presentation of symptoms. It was really that my heart rate was extremely low and I was swollen and feeling not well. But in that moment, ultimately, I was able to text a friend who's a doctor. She was like, I think, do you have a blood pressure cuff at home? Did they send you home with one? Is that something you have? We went to Target, grabbed it, and sure enough, it was, as I look back on that experience, and I'm now in this position focused on postpartum care for those who are traditionally left out of systems of care and systems of support. And my experience, I feel very lucky to have the health that I have now. And I am fearful for those who do not have the access to what I had.
Welcome to the Golden Hour, the podcast community where moms and moms-to-be hear stories from other mothers and top experts in the pregnancy and postpartum care field. You can visit goldenhour.fm for more information, resources, and all other episodes. You can also find us at goldenhour.fm on Instagram for comments and questions. Welcome to the Golden Hour. I'm your host, Dr. O, and today's guest is someone who's doing the kind of work that we all say is needed in postpartum care and actually is making it happen on the ground. I'm thrilled to welcome Rachel Scandling, the Executive Director of Fourth Trimester, a nonprofit redefining what postpartum support should look like, especially for communities too often left out of traditional systems. Low-income families, immigrants, asylum-seeking moms, and parents recovering from disasters. Based in Southern California and the U.S.-Mexican border region, Fourth Trimester provides practical support, emotional care, and advocacy rooted in dignity and community care. Rachel brings nearly 20 years of leadership across LA's public, academic, and nonprofit sectors, and she spent her entire career centering around women's experiences. She's also a mom of two, a systems thinker, and a passionate believer in rebuilding postpartum care from the ground up. Rachel, I'm so honored to have you here today and very, very excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. O. And it's our pleasure to be here. I say our as an organization, but mine personally as well.
Yeah, well, this, as I shared in the pre-recording, this conversation is months in the making, so it's going to be totally worth the wait. And as you probably know from our previous call before even scheduling this podcast recording, postpartum care is a passion of mine. It's what actually initially inspired the podcast, even though the podcast has expanded to include so many other important topics under the huge umbrella that is women's health. It's really that paucity of postpartum care that I saw day in, day out as a clinician, let alone, hearing from the experiences of my closest girlfriends, that really just made me feel frustrated. And like any ambitious person, I was inspired to turn that pain into passion and into something productive. So my little platform is this podcast and the space to have conversations that are so deeply important, not only to my patient community, but myself as a clinician and as a woman. I'd love to learn about your passion. What inspired you to work to create Fourth Trimester? What was it that broke your heart and inspired you to build something that's better?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I, too, feel like seeing experiences from friends, family members, hearing about it before I had my own experience in postpartum, really, from an outside perspective at the time, felt like something needed to change in there, needed to be focused on it. And I first gave birth 6 years ago. I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. And, very supported relative to many women and birthing people, and feeling really positive going into my own birth experience. And I'll share a little bit about my first postpartum experience.
Please.
But I'll say that that experience was one at the time that did not catapult me into this work. I think it took a little bit
Mm.
of time to understand the depth of that experience, and then my second postpartum experience. So I feel very lucky to be in this work now. My background has been in systems and work in the arts, particularly in LA County with a focus on feminist practices, right?
Mhm.
And of course, I come with that lens into this work as well. But I was
Yeah.
not working in maternal health before I had my children. So I gave birth, as I said, 6 years ago for the first time, and had a very healthy pregnancy. I had a breech presentation, so I delivered via a scheduled cesarean. The delivery went well, on all accounts at the time. What happened was that I ended up with severe postpartum preeclampsia that was diagnosed
Oh,
5 days after I went home. So
yeah.
I had a very severe experience. I was hospitalized for a week,
Mm. Mm.
and it was very unexpected given my health during pregnancy and health during
Yeah.
delivery, right? And so, in that moment, as someone who had a birth doula, even at my scheduled cesarean, who
Yeah.
had lactation support at home, who had access to family support staying with us at that time, the ultimate reason that we discovered postpartum preeclampsia was I was my own advocate. I was like,
Mm.
something's off, something's not right. I'm not feeling well. I was not having typical presentation of symptoms. It was really that my heart rate was extremely low and I was swollen and feeling not well. But
Mhm.
in that moment, ultimately, I was able to text a friend who's a doctor and say, "Hey, what this is?" She had also given birth to her first child 9 months prior. So I felt kindred in a way. And
Mhm.
she was like, I think, do you have a blood pressure cuff at home? Did they send you home with one? Is that something you have? We went to Target, grabbed it, and sure enough, it was through the roof. So
Ugh.
that was a really challenging experience. Of course, then it has reciprocal or not reciprocal, but after effects. Feeding was really hard following that with
Mm.
breastfeeding. And that has strains on mental health, of course, and we can get into
Mhm.
all of these intersecting things. But as I look back on that experience, and I'm now in this position focused on postpartum care for those who are traditionally left out of systems of
Yeah.
care and systems of support, and my experience, I feel very lucky to have the health that I
Mhm.
have now. And I
Mhm.
am fearful for those who do not have the access to what I had
Yeah.
postpartum. And even then, I was not educated. I actually did not know that postpartum preeclampsia was a thing. I knew about
Mhm.
preeclampsia in pregnancy, but I didn't understand that it was something that I should be fearful of, or not fearful, aware of
Mhm.
following birth. So that my experience there, feeling and remembering that it was so hard for me and wondering what must it be like for someone who is displaced, who is away from family, who is struggling financially, who does not have culturally competent care that's
Mhm.
going to understand them. So that was, you know, to go to the question, what broke my heart a bit to
Yeah.
come back into this work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I mean, hearing your story, I think about the many moms that I've had to readmit through the emergency room with postpartum preeclampsia, right? That
Yep.
how jarring that experience is where you're already probably a flood of emotions bringing the newborn home, especially if it's your first baby, where it's like a mix of, excitement and joy, but a lot of anxious energy too,
Yeah.
right? Because you're like, what am I supposed to do with this tiny human? And this is mine forever. And then suddenly, whether it's a specific symptom, or maybe you already were tracking your blood pressures, there's
Yeah.
a reason to go back to the hospital, and it really is like being ripped from the sanctity and stability of home, having something that you totally didn't necessarily anticipate or predict, and then having to go through an emergency room, which is chaotic and
Mm.
takes hours of time. And even the last patient who I readmitted one of my calls recently, as I'm talking to her about postpartum preeclampsia and what to expect, someone's in the hallway, and no offense to the other patient, but is having like a mental break, right? It's like that's a
Mhm.
lot to take in while you're just trying to focus on your postpartum care and the newborn that is sitting at bedside with you with your partner. And so
Yeah.
I think of myself as by nature an empathetic person, because I think for most of us in medicine, you need that to be a part of your strong suits. But I'm even that much more sensitive to my postpartum readmissions, the patients who have to
Yeah.
be readmitted to the hospital, where I really say, hey, I'm so sorry that you're here, but I'm so grateful that you're here because part of these rates of maternal mortality and these rates that we know that disproportionately affect women of color is amongst different causes of death. Preeclampsia, whether it's in pregnancy or postpartum, is on that list. And
Yep.
can you imagine, I am an OBGYN to any woman who knows me, including all friends from all walks of life. And so I get a lot of text messages
I bet.
myself. And so, imagine if you didn't have a good friend who was in medicine. Imagine if you didn't have, that space to be aware of your body. For some patients, I think of how busy they are. They go home to, multiple other kids and other life demands and other family members that they're supporting. And some people have to go back to work extremely too soon. Imagine if you didn't have the space
Mhm.
to just say, hey, something feels off with my body, let alone
Yeah.
the lack of education, even for you. What I appreciate you, Rachel, is you're acknowledging your privilege, right? That's the
Yep.
first thing that you said, right? You imagine the privilege that you have and the education that comes from your privilege. And even for you, you didn't know that postpartum preeclampsia was an etiology, right? And
Yep.
so I oftentimes, as an OBGYN doctor slash podcast host, when I'm doing these episodes, when I think about every scenario, I think about what can we do better as clinicians, right? That I think, that's the tricky thing about prenatal care is it's all about prepping for the birth of the baby. We can't spend enough time on postpartum, whether it's postpartum complications that are rare but serious, like postpartum preeclampsia, and the multitude of support that people need postpartum, whether it's feeding support, mood support, physical support in terms of pelvic PT and everything under that umbrella. And so the demand is huge, and I think that you are one of many who understand that pregnancy and postpartum, for lack of a better word, is a much bigger deal than I think our
Mhm.
society recognizes. I think that it's too simple to say, like, it's a given. You have a baby, you take the baby home, you have, like, 6 to 8 weeks postpartum, because that's the real postpartum period, quote unquote. We know that's not true. And then, go back to work, go back to contributing to
Right.
society. Like, you've got to go. And so I think time and time again, it's conversations on the podcast like this, but also just the day to day of what I see, let alone what you've seen in your work with fourth trimester that says no, it is so much more than that. And so, my if I had a wish list, high on that wish list is that somehow, some point, a conversation that we're having on this episode gets to the right ear,
Mhm.
an ear that has a lot of power. And I'm sure the team at fourth trimester are rallying and organizing and trying to lobby and reach said ears to make sure that the postpartum care um, advocacy trickles down to everyone,
Mhm.
not only the privileged, but more importantly, those who are underserved and underinsured, those same mortality rates that, I remember being faced with when I was in pre-med at Stanford. I was like, "Oh my god, like, obstetrics seems like a really not this, happy, presumably happy field. Like, there's really, things that are happening
Yeah.
that deserve change." And I naturally am I'm a change maker or aspire to be one. So I remember kind of when I learned about these concepts in my undergrad classes being like, okay, well then that sounds like the space I should be in. I got to fix this not only for other women, but for myself, right? Like, I am a woman of color.
Mhm.
I have an older sister. I come from a large family of many, many women, which means I have a lot of cousins who will go on to be mothers themselves. And so it was like this personal journey that I assumed and hoped would trickle down to others. Anyway, so that's my own. I
Yeah.
shared that to kind of impart my own passion for what you not only experienced personally and what inevitably became such an important space of advocacy going forward. Part of what I shared at the beginning of this episode in your intro is that you've spent nearly 2 decades supporting women across different sectors. What was a moment or experience that had, besides your own personal journey, that really said, hey, postpartum justice is where I need to be? Was there a particular interaction with someone in your community? Was it a story that you read about in the news? What was it for you that really kind of pivoted your focus not only on, again, your own personal experience, but those who are underserved?
Yeah, and I just to respond to one thing you said about, if there are postpartum complications, getting access to care. I mean, thinking about even the base level of being able to get transportation back to the hospital, much less childcare if you can't bring
Mhm.
your newborn with you, right? There are people who are so alone in this journey. And I think we can talk about that too, about isolation. But there are just folks who do not have base level support, whether
Yeah.
it's financial or community.
Yeah.
And those are the families and the birthing people that we worry about the most, right? And think about if we can't support at that level, then we don't have a value system that cares about mothers. And
Agreed.
so that is an entry point, I think, into this work for me.
Mhm.
Got the opportunity to work with fourth trimester. We were previously named Mama to Mama. So at the time, 2 years ago, it
Mm.
was Mama to Mama
Mhm.
through one of the co founders, Marisa Callahan, and the other co founder, Kayla Willingham, had been doing some work at the US Mexico border in Tijuana
Mhm.
and came with this idea initially for a program which is operating still and is the first program of the organization called Mamas at the Border. And it supports migrant and asylum seeking mothers in Tijuana at one particular shelter with postpartum and maternity care. So I was able to see that in action, the
Mhm.
work that Kayla in particular was already doing to build
Mhm.
community with birthing women and then
Mhm.
partner with ancestral midwives with
Mm.
mental health provisions and just essential care was an eye opener for me also in seeing folks who were in displacement, in
Mhm.
migration, who had little to no access even to essential items in postpartum.
Mhm.
You also think about community living immediately following birth and no privacy. So that's
Yeah.
something that really allowed me to say, yes, I'm ready to hop into this work. I
Yeah.
myself do not have a maternal health background, but I do have leadership and organizational work
Yeah.
and a passion for women's advancement and rights. And it
Mhm.
just felt like a moment to say yes, to put my own personal experience, of course, yes, but to bring to life some of the work that was already naturally happening and
Mhm.
realize that into an organization of its own. And I can talk a bit about the rebrand and then, of course, our work responding to the LA wildfires and how that's really cemented and solidified a model of care for our organization.
Yeah. No, I mean, you already alluded to, you know, some important aspects of postpartum care that can be so limited, whether it's, I mean, access just in general, and then access to kind of basic necessities, right? Like I'm thinking about when patients ask me, okay, like what should I bring to the hospital? What do I need? And again, I practice in the Bay Area, and I have the fortune of caring for a very diverse patient population, but a lot of my patients do have, are relatively resourced. So when I talk about what you need, I always often say, like, we don't really need anything because what you really need, the hospital provide, right?
Yep.
You need pads, you need some access to, ibuprofen or Tylenol, and then, a comfortable bed to rest in, right? Everything else, whether it's your robe, your favorite robe, and some slippers and some mood music, everything else is extra to add to the comfort. But I can only imagine if even access to those basic necessities are limited. I could appreciate how eye-opening that experience was when you were down and at the border. What did you see in LA, and along the border that made you realize that these traditional systems weren't necessarily meeting families' needs? And let's speak more specifically to, because I think you spoke about different things that fourth trimester allows, but let's talk about more specifically what fourth trimester has done for those families at the border.
Yeah, absolutely. That program, Mamas at the Border, really helped us build, like I said, a model of care and lean into this idea of wraparound support
Mhm,
for a birthing person, in particular, mothers maybe who it was their first child as well.
mhm.
So, that deep transition into a new life for everybody.
Yeah.
But yeah, in particular with Mamas at the Border, we make sure that we are providing community, which we
Mhm,
feel is critical to feeling supported in postpartum. And we see that show up, and I'll talk about our wildfire relief efforts as well.
mhm,
We know that isolation can be a huge component in
mhm.
reports of depression, anxiety in postpartum, but broadly in maternal health, right?
Yeah.
So we built a community room that mothers could come to and be together and really have either table activities where they could sit around and share through the art of craft making, through conversation, something to do during a time that was deeply in transition for them
Mhm.
as they, at the time, awaited their asylum cases and their interviews. I should
Mhm.
say, of course, as of January 2025, the border is effectively closed to taking asylum interviews. So many of the families have either returned to their home countries, have resettled in the Tijuana area. We are still supporting women who are there who are birthing. I believe there are 3 pregnant women right now who we are currently supporting, and others who have birthed within the last year. With that said, we also have a full-time program coordinator there who
Mm.
is herself a survivor of sexual assault, and she
Mm.
has children herself and is there regularly as someone to just facilitate group togetherness with the mothers,
Yeah.
provide essential care, right? Yes, those essential items are kind of that entry point into coming
Yeah.
into the space and being together. And then we are able to provide through other providers mental health support. So we do weekly group mental health care for the mothers. We do parenting education, parenting and understanding how to parent, especially as your baby ages into toddlerdom.
Mhm.
You're in a new environment, you have different cultures coming in with different perspectives on parenting. That's something we really focus on there. We
Yeah.
also provide one-on-one mental health support with a psychologist there. And then I think really critically partner with an incredible ancestral midwifery organization who has 2 birth centers in Tijuana to ensure that mothers and families who are birthing have access to care outside of the hospital system if
Mhm.
needed and if desired. I think the other thing, and this is back to what everyone should be provided, is access to emergency transportation. So we
Mm.
actually provided the funds to purchase a vehicle to make sure there was always a vehicle available to take moms to appointments and take them in emergency situations if they
Mm.
needed to either birth or during pregnancy, as we know, if there are complications. And so
Yeah.
that was something really critical. I think if I can pivot just to talk about how that model has shifted for the LA wildfires and what we're
Yeah.
seeing for families here. When the wildfires broke out across LA, we saw that, families, of course, were dealing with the prospects of birth and crisis, immediate displacement all at the same time. And
Mhm.
systems, I think, that are traditionally designed to support people were just not available or not accessible for
Yeah.
any number of factors, depending on how a family was impacted. And so we met moms who were still recovering from birth, who had nowhere to return to, processing the trauma of losing their home, figuring out where to be, and in displacement, right? And so it's a similar pattern that we had been working with at the border.
Yeah.
Mothers recovering from birth in the midst of displacement. So, while very different situations and environments, we thought that we could start with building a model of support for families who are in crisis here. And
Mhm.
so that led to us immediately following the fires a week after January 7th, started actually with mutual aid. And mutual aid is a model that I've loved and followed in my other work in having open source availability to see who's available to support one another. We did it
Mhm.
simply through a Google Sheet and we opened it up on our communications channels and said, are there families who need support and are there birth workers in particular, midwives, doulas, lactation consultants, perinatal mental health professionals who are offering pro bono support or prorated support during this time of crisis.
Mm.
There were so many providers, practitioners who were offering care during that time, and we wanted to
Yeah.
help make the connection. Could we be that immediate support that says, you don't have to search for someone during this time, fill out our form, we will pair you or match you with someone. So
Mm.
overnight, we became care coordinators in
Yeah.
our organization. And we started with that mutual aid in the very generous birth worker community to ensure that families who were currently pregnant or within the first year of postpartum impacted by the fires were receiving specific care that they needed. And then we began to subsidize that work. So if it was not pro bono, if it was prorated, our organization covered the difference for families so that they
Mm,
didn't have to worry about that cost at that time. And they
yeah.
also didn't have to worry about if that additional support was going to show up in a time of immediate transition. We had families, for example, who were planning on birthing in Pasadena and their home was gone and they needed to
Mm,
birth in Orange County because that's where they were staying for the foreseeable future. And immediately different care teams, different hospitals.
yeah.
So we would provide access to birth support depending on where families were at that time. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, imagining the 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 weight that you've lifted, off the shoulders of so many families, let alone at the border and in LA, right? I think I can felt your excitement to share about the LA experience because one, who could have predicted such a horrific tragedy would happen
Right.
so close to home for you. And I have a lot of family and friends in Southern California. I think
Mm.
California in general is the state of my birth and it is home for me too. What serendipity, even though it was a natural disaster, what serendipity that the work that you guys had initiated south of the border and the models that you guys already thoughtfully laid out was so ready to be translatable for other displaced families and communities. And I think, and this is probably on the vision board of the fourth trimester team, is imagine how many natural disasters sadly happen all over our nation, right? You know,
Yes.
in the south, in the southeast with hurricanes, in the Midwest, tornadoes, right? That there are so many, families and communities of people who have either recently birthed or preparing to birth who are all affected by those things. And it, as great as FEMA, well, I don't
Hmm.
know, a- as available as FEMA tries to make itself to be, that's still not care that is focused on a very different type of need. And
Yeah.
so I see so many use cases for an organization like Fourth Trimester. So I'd like to take a moment to tell you this is my passion project based on years of experience as an OB/GYN doctor. I aim to empower moms and moms-to-be and those in the pregnancy and postpartum care space. If you appreciate what I do, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share with your friends so we can reach more people like you. You can visit goldenhour.fm for more information, resources, and all other episodes. If you have any requests, suggestions, or questions for future episodes, please email me at hello@goldenhour.fm or leave us a comment at goldenhour.fm on Instagram. Before we kind of do a deeper dive, I'd love to think back and talk more about your work at south of the border, and then we'll spend more time on LA and present. But from my experience in my training, I did a fair share of global health work, and one of
Hmm.
my reflections when I did global health is this idea of it's one thing to kind of show up and maybe give a community some new technology or some new ideas and then leave, right? That's not nearly as sustainable as actually
Hmm.
going to the community, finding out what they need, finding out those in the community who have the skill sets to provide that need, and making sure that the system that was offered is something that's sustainable and needed by that community, right? That there's this kind of Western #white
Hmm.
savior complex that happens in so many global health arenas that for me as a provider of color, I was always so sensitive to when I either, joined a research group or any kind of medical mission group of, what impact are we making and is impact something that's lasting? And would it exist even if everyone was out of that place?
Hmm.
And when you described what fourth trimester is doing in Tijuana, like I said, it's very impressive to me. And it sounds like there's a lot of players and a lot of buy-in from local team members, but how did you guys go about making sure that the work of fourth trimester is sustainable in a place like Tijuana, and what does it look like to get community investment behind an organization like this?
Yeah, I so appreciate that perspective. And we actually, the very first board member of fourth trimester works in consulting with the UN Foundation
Mm,
on girls and women's initiatives and has a background in global health, particularly maternal health. And that was really
yeah.
important to us because we wanted to ensure that whatever we began with our organization had sustainability as a part
Mhm,
of it. And a little shout out to our strategic planners, which we went through a strategic plan in 2024. But our guiding question when we were first thinking about programming was how can we equitably, thoughtfully, and sustainably enter this landscape and provide care? And that has
mhm,
really guided any origin of services that we provide.
mhm,
And I personally, and this is an ethos of the organization, feel that we are stronger through partnerships and
mhm,
stronger through allowing the uplifting of the partners that we have, whether they're organizations or individuals, in their own strengths to ensure that we can fill a gap. One, not overlap work that already exists, right? But make sure that it is culturally competent, make sure that it is community based and community led, which I think is really critical.
yeah,
We have multiple partners in Tijuana. El Otro Lado is a legal services organization that is transborder. They're Mexican and US based. And then Parteria y Medicinas Ancestrales is the ancestral midwife organization. Making sure that we're embedding with organizations who've been
mhm,
there doing the work
mhm,
and saying, we are seeing this particular need. We want to support postpartum. We understand that you're doing adjacent work or work that
mhm,
can provide a complement to what we're doing. How can we work together? So that's how the work actually started. The
mm,
very first things that happened in Tijuana, even before providing through our community space, was partnering with Refugee Health Alliance health organization in Tijuana that the midwives were working out of with essential item kits. So we did hygiene kits, postpartum care kits, and actually birth kits. The birth kits provided some of the medical supplies required by the Tijuana General Hospital that were not otherwise paid for. So we ensured that
mm,
families had access to the medical equipment that they needed in order to not have to fund that themselves or come into a birth, without the supplies they needed.
mhm.
But I don't believe we have all the answers. I think that we are stronger in community and together, and that has really been something that's guided, yes, the work in Tijuana, but very much the work in Los Angeles and hopefully in California and beyond as we grow too.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I appreciate your honesty. I think anyone who's entering a different community, whether the difference is based on ethnic background, language, you know, and all the multitude of cultural differences has to do so with humility, right? And you
Yes,
won't be successful unless you do that. And the partnerships that you guys have been able to develop with the ancestral midwives and the mental health providers and setting up transport systems, that success is only because those people on the ground actually believed and trusted in you guys. All right. And so I think that is so that's not an easy task to do by any means, and so I don't wanna diminish the effort that it took to build what you guys have built there. That's why I took the time to pause and ask that question,
yeah,
right? Because I think, there are a lot of global mission work, and not all of it is as benign or genuine as they would seem to be at the surface, and so I think any of us who are, again, investing in communities outside of our own have to do so with
mhm,
cultural competency, curiosity, and sensitivity, and it sounds like what the 4th trimester is doing, which brings us to a community that is your own. So LA,
yeah,
those wildfires, it's crazy to imagine it's been almost a year, right? So
mhm.
because you said January 7th.
January 7th.
Yeah, yeah, I cannot believe it's almost a year, and even thinking about the date, I think as it was happening, my brain didn't necessarily, like, put the exact time
Yeah,
with where it was in relation to, like, literally right after the holidays and,
yep,
what it was, emotionally probably a high for so many people, for most people, and then having this occur, within weeks of that. Obviously, LA fortunately has not suffered a massive fire since then, but what does fourth trimester's impact in LA look like now? Are you guys, seeking other communities and groups to serve besides the continued work in Tijuana? And I'd love, in that to segue and also talk more about the rebrand from Mamas to
Yeah.
Mamas to fourth trimester.
Yeah. I really think that we cannot talk about the rebrand without the wildfires because we did
Yeah,
that work at the same time. So
yeah.
we just 6 months ago decided that we wanted to rebrand. And while Mama to Mama is a name I love, we felt it wasn't totally representative of the focus that we had on postpartum and
Mm,
frankly not as inclusive. We wanted something that
mm,
included everybody, every identity as a birthing person,
mhm,
but also every person in our society. We all have to focus on postpartum if there's a
mhm,
change. It has to be the partners, it has to be the non birthing folks, it has to be every age. It can't
mhm.
just be moms to moms
Yep.
who are doing the work for ourselves, right? So that was part of the rebrand. And I think we had in our strategic planning often used fourth trimester. It's a phrase we know in maternal health and it is claiming that, right? And putting that into practice and saying, this term can be provocative for those who have not heard it. And it also is something that reflects our bold belief, I think, which is that that period following birth is a tender stage of life that matters and one that demands or should demand its own attention and own set of important needs. So, to talk about the rebrand of fourth trimester, we really, we love Mama to Mama as a name, yes, but it felt not inclusive of every identity of a birthing person. And also, it did not call in everybody who needs to focus on postpartum. Fourth
Yeah.
trimester is a name that can call in everybody. We need partners. We need men. We need all ages, right? Those who are grandparents to those who might be giving birth in the coming decades
Mhm,
to understand that postpartum is a time of deep care and of deep
mhm.
need, right? And so it was important to, as an organization, decide that fourth trimester would reflect our bold belief that this tender stage of life is one that is its own set of needs and is enough to refer to it as its own separate trimester. And my 6-year-old son always likes to say, but mom, that's in threes. And I always say, yes,
He's
that's the
smart.
point. That's right. But that's the
Yeah.
point. We want you to question and say, wait, why does this matter? And then we have
Mhm.
the opportunity to share with you all of the deep need that postpartum has on its own. And,
Yeah.
look, and this is probably not new to your listeners at all, but we know that the US has one of the highest maternal mortality rates among developed nations. And 2/3 of those deaths happen after birth. They
Mhm.
happen in postpartum. And so, right when complications following birth are, I would guess, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but at their highest is right when care starts to taper off for the birthing
Mhm.
person. We
Mhm.
have a 6-week visit, right? We don't have much in between birth and 6 weeks unless there's a complication. And there are still many, many needs that birthing people have, whether it's related to mental health, isolation, physical, medical complications. And so we really wanted, with a name, to call attention to that particular period after birth. Of course, postpartum period extends well beyond the 3 months following birth, but that is one of heightened need
Yeah.
and intensity. And so, with the wildfire relief program, it really was about survival for so many. How
Mm.
were they going to survive displacement, survive this deep financial strain that this had? We know that giving birth is a huge financial burden for many families.
Mhm.
And we saw that so many just didn't know where to turn in our
Mhm.
community in LA. And so we really looked at this wraparound care that we had developed in Tijuana and built off of that for the initial part of support for families impacted by the wildfires. And I had mentioned we had started with mutual aid and birth worker care. And we
Mhm.
very quickly decided that we wanted to get cash into the hands of families who were most impacted. And so we very quickly in January raised $20,000, and by Valentine's Day
Wow.
distributed that to 35 families. And it was true just
Yeah.
emergency cash assistance, $500 to $1,000, a band-aid, but fill the gap for the end of the month, or to support, the replacement of items that were really necessary. And because of the need that came in and the incredible focus from so we provided this cash as emergency assistance. And I should pause and say, in one of the partnerships that we developed early as an organization to speak to this model of entering a landscape and making sure that we were amplifying work that others were already doing and coming in to fill a gap maybe that others couldn't in terms of community organizations, other providers. We had partnered with a guaranteed income program in LA County that was providing mothers with cash monthly, and
Mm,
we had been the partner to provide essential items and help build community, because we know that's really essential, right, in positive postpartum
mm,
outcomes. So we already had an awareness of universal and unconditional cash transfers, right? This model of providing cash, no strings attached, to ensure that families have better maternal health and infant health outcomes. And
mm,
we really have been interested in how fourth trimester could enter that space, and emergency assistance following the wildfires was our ability to do so and also meet a need that we saw. There was this deep need for
yeah.
families who really had so little at that time. And so we decided that we were not just going to do a one-time cash assistance emergency grant in February, but that we would make it quarterly throughout 2025. And I think that's also
Mm,
something to talk to the response of, how do you show up and continue showing up, and not just do
mm-hmm.
one-time service, and make sure that you're really going to be available for families, especially in that first year postpartum. We had women in the program who were giving birth in January and February. And then, of course, they're postpartum. Their first year, their babies are still not even a year old on this date.
Yeah.
Right. And so we
Yeah.
still wanted to be in their lives supporting. So subsequently, about 3 weeks ago, we just closed our fourth cycle of cash assistance, and we granted $187,000 to nearly 200 families throughout
Amazing.
this time period. And the idea was that we wanted to build consistency, right, of cash support, but we also really wanted to model community care.
Mm-hmm.
We also provided an opportunity for families to get to know one another and to gather in space. So we host monthly care closets in Pasadena, an opportunity for families to come and shop for free, essential goods, items that they might need, yes, in postpartum care, but it's hygiene, it's baby items, it's new clothing, it's
Mm,
toys. We have our next one on Wednesday in 2 days, and we have more than 50 families joining us to come together for this time.
yeah.
And the really great thing is, they love each other. They love seeing each other. They hold each other's babies. Their babies know each other.
Oh,
Everyone's in the same age. So
yeah.
you effectively have built this community of support. And each
Yeah.
one of those families has received some set of other care from us, whether it was a lactation consultant that came in home, postpartum meal delivery, making sure that they were a part of a mental health support circle that we offer biweekly. It's virtual, it's with a perinatal psychologist in LA, and it's open, it's steady. Every 2 weeks, families can come together, share. We also help offer vouchers and referrals to local perinatal mental health practices. One partner of ours is Black Girls Mental Health Collective, who's been phenomenal
Mm,
in referrals, right? So we don't have to be the
yeah.
ones doing the work, but can we help support access to that care?
Exactly.
And that's been really critical to building out this model of support. So we deeply believe in cash support, cash transfers, and I can talk more about that, but it is one part of many in terms of a wheel of care that we want to provide in postpartum.
Yeah. Well, Rachel, if I may, there's so many things that you spoke to that I just want to highlight. Number one, with the name, the rebrand, right? That so much of postpartum care, as we know it, has been structurally limited by insurance companies, right? And that the realistic, or the real reason rather, why, visits are limited to 6 weeks postpartum for vaginal delivery, or so rather, that's maternity leave is limited to 6 weeks postpartum for vaginal delivery, 8 weeks postpartum for C-section, is about what insurance companies and disability that pays into disability will pay into. Of course, if you're very
Hmm.
fortunate, as are my friends who work in bigger tech companies, maybe get 3 months or 4 months, and that
Hmm.
is a pure luxury. Meanwhile, our neighbors in Europe and in Scandinavian countries have at least a year, and that's their standard of care. And we could spend many, many hours discussing
Hmm.
why that is the goal, that's the dream. And really, for me as a clinician, what I know, it was amazing a couple years ago when we went from just like one routine 6 weeks postpartum visit to now everyone is guaranteed an early postpartum visit at 2 to 3 weeks. But that was a big improvement.
Yeah.
And as we just spent the first, 20, 30 minutes of our episode discussing, the unexpected complications can happen within those first couple weeks. Even by the time I get to 6 weeks postpartum visit, there are some patients who are, doing well. They have good community support. They have a plan. I can tell that they are, progressing well in terms of postpartum journey. But there are even more patients who are dealing with feeding issues, who are dealing with postpartum depression and anxiety, who truly are not ready to go back to work and truly need me, or support rather, beyond that 6 week visit. And I think, again, to go back to what I shared at the beginning of the episode, it's really that sense of internal disappointment that I felt so often at that 6 week postpartum visit, where it's like, there's so much more we need to do. There's so much more ways that we can show up for these patients. I'm saying goodbye, see you in a year when you're due for your pap smear. But like, during that postpartum visit and your pap smear, your life has changed entirely.
Hmm.
Your mind, your body, your soul, right? That this concept of matrescence, which I'm sure you're familiar with,
Yep.
really speaks to the pivotal, deep change that someone goes through, as similar as adolescence, when from even beginning of a pregnancy through the postpartum period. And it's not limited to just, fourth trimester alone. It can be years even. But I think fourth trimester really kind of helps make it a point, that it's beyond just 6 weeks. I love the idea that it's, yeah, your 6-year-old is quite like, "Why isn't that?" "Well, that's like
Yeah.
only 3 months."
Yeah.
It's true, but
Yeah.
it's really this idea that, like, it's also on the spectrum and trajectory of a woman's health as it relates to their pregnancy care, that so much of medical care is prenatally focused, because there's incentive to reduce the risk of complications in pregnancy and around delivery. But, you spoke to data that says that majority of those, of our maternal mortality rates in the US are actually related to postpartum complications, right? So I think really naming fourth trimester says that actually just as important as it is caring for the newborn growing in someone's body, and that's the primary
Hmm.
focus of prenatal care, to be honest, is actually postpartum care for that person who, did so much to grow that baby within their body, and is also the one who has to nurture and support that baby, let alone their families and community. I think the other piece that you spoke to is how vital community is, right? That
Yeah.
so many conversations I have on this podcast really speaks to the fact that one of the reasons why I think so many people struggle postpartum is that traditional village that our ancestors were nourished and thrived in doesn't exist anymore. That the more advancements we make in technology, the more isolated we become, the farther our family is away from us, right? Some people are lucky if their family is local, but for most of us, we don't live close by. And even the friends that we have are all kind of in their little islands. And so much to me of postpartum, care, and re-engineering it and restructuring it so that it's more, not only more accessible, but more successful, is rebuilding that sense of community, reclaiming that village. And it's not a surprise that, like, community is bedrock of what
Yeah.
fourth trimester is doing. And I love the imagery of seeing, again, families that were displaced and suffered such a traumatic event as the LA wildfires, who have joy in seeing each other time and time again at these closets. I know I'm kind of getting nearer to our time, and so end of our time, and there's so much more that we can talk about. But really, it's clear that what your team at Fourth Trimester is doing is making bringing a focus to postpartum care in a way that it truly deserves, knowing that the way that you support any birther will trickle down to their family members, their friends, and their community at large. If you could redesign postpartum care in the US tomorrow, what are the first 3 things that you would fix?
Oh, goodness. I feel like there are so many, but I really do believe access to postpartum doula care in home. And I think
Mm,
that speaks to something around community as well, right? When
mm,
you are cared for in your place of living and when you are stable in your home environment, someone who can come in and understand that maybe just a warm meal and listening to you talk about your feeding experience, for example,
mhm,
can go
mhm,
so far in mental health support during that time.
mhm,
So I would love postpartum doula care for all birthing people in this country. Postpartum doula care is standard in some countries and not just in that immediate period following birth, but following up later, making sure that we have pelvic health support as well, right? But
yeah,
starting with postpartum doula care is one. And I think there are phenomenal nurses who do in-home checkups through Nurse Family Partnership and others, right? There's that
mhm,
type of model of care, but it's not broad. And I would love trained postpartum doula care for every family. I
I
really
love
do
that.
believe that guaranteed paid leave, to speak to a point that you made, for birthing people and partners would be critical to postpartum health and progress.
Mhm,
I am someone who, full-time employment with both of my births. I was not at fourth trimester. I was at another job and I did not have paid leave. So I applied for
mm,
pregnancy disability and FMLA, right, which just guarantees you have a job. And then pregnancy disability leave in the state of California, at least, does subsidize some of your salary and or your wages. But I will say, and you kind of pointed to this, in 6 or 8 weeks of disability, when I was hospitalized following my first birth, I went back to my OBGYN and said, is there any way to sign my letter to request more time on disability, more
yeah,
support? Because I feel like I'm 10 days behind. I didn't get back home from my readmission until after 10 days postpartum. That felt like
mm,
day one for me. Right. And I
yeah,
had gone through a cesarean, I had gone through this trauma following birth. And her answer was very kind, but also, I don't have the power to do that. And I wish I could. Right. It's the
mm,
policy that has the power. So, guaranteed paid leave for someone like me in that situation, and longer leave, right, would have provided me more healing in a time of deep trauma. And
yeah,
I think there are so many, like I said, who have many intersecting levels of barrier for access to care or community support,
mhm,
whether it's cultural or socioeconomic, right? And so if we had paid leave at a standard level across this country, I think there are so many people who would have better health outcomes, both
oh,
for
and move
mother,
mountains,
yes,
yeah,
and infant, right? Not just
mhm,
for mom and birthing person.
mhm,
And then because I'm a big believer in it, the third would be unconditional cash transfers for low
mm,
income birthing parents to stabilize and lower stress, right, in this immense time of
yeah,
change. I do think if our base needs are not met, if we are unstable in housing or unable to have the necessities at home, we are much more likely to have poor outcomes. And
yeah,
there's so much more, like, free
I'm
perinatal
sure.
mental health support, normalizing and
Exactly,
creating access to doula care, lactation support, free childcare. We could talk about that, but those would be my top three, I think.
yeah. No, I wholeheartedly agree, and the list is long, and I think for me, I have the fortune, obviously, not only to see what I see day in and day out from the work that I do, but I have the fortune of seeing other models of care that are aspirational. My husband is Turkish, but spent most of his adult life in Europe, and so we have good friends who, raising families in Finland, good friends who
Mhm.
had children in Germany, and a lot of those things on your wish list are things that are standard there, and it
Yes.
really changes the dynamic for an entire community when both the birther and their support person has a guaranteed time off, so they're not stressed about their financial security, let alone their job security. Free childcare makes a huge difference for any family. My husband and I have not yet started a family, but part of the analysis that we constantly do is understanding that in the Bay Area, any childcare that we spend is similar. It's like a college tuition, right? That's can make a huge impact on any family of any economic standing. And the list goes on and on and on. And so I patiently await the moment where we understand the way that, other countries, European countries specifically, value families and value that the contribution of women and birthers to the community in a way that these are kind of systematic expectations rather than privilege. And that requires policy, and that requires conversations like these, and work that you and the team at Fourth Trimester have done, will continue to do until it becomes like the norm, the standard rather than the exception. How can clinicians and health systems meaningfully partner with organizations like yours? What does it look like for me as an OBGYN to kind of integrate into the system and the families that you're serving?
Yeah, you said sometimes you see women and moms at 6 weeks, and it's like, what's next sometimes. And
Mhm.
we see ourselves as part of a larger support system that works together, right? Postpartum needs are deeply complex, and no single organization or provider, right, can address all of it. And so it's back to the partnerships. And for clinicians, I would see, those of you managing medical care to be able to refer your clients, your patients to our organization as a resource to say, you can find a community here. You can find potential cash support here. You can find someone who's going to help you access mental health support in a group setting or one on one, who will take the burden of finding that provider off of you,
Yeah,
right? So we really try
yeah.
and do that. We say, okay, that's great. Let's pair you or partner you with this great practice that we know, or this individual provider, and take that burden. Sometimes it's just like going through the process of finding the care that you need. And I'm
Mhm.
coming at that from a really privileged perspective. I have access to the internet. I have a computer. I have a phone. I can search. Think about families
Mhm.
who have really limited access to, whether it's a language barrier, a technology barrier, right? So
Yeah.
being a one stop shop, right, to refer into. And then, really making sure that just sharing the possibility of the integration of doula care in birth, right? We know that's becoming a bit more focused on and successful in certain states. Michigan now is adding doula care through Medicaid, Medi-Cal in California. Of course, LA County just added doula care. I know it's problematic in some ways in terms of payment systems and support. But the more that we can advocate for every piece of provider or community based organization care, we're one part of many. So,
Yeah.
I think if we can actually make ourselves accessible to you as the provider, and you share the work that we're doing, to me, an individual experience can only amplify the accessibility for someone else. The more people that
Mm.
receive this care who can talk about the care that they receive, the more of a community building approach we will have in terms of speaking, knowledge to power in terms of what's possible.
Yeah, it's a ripple effect.
Mhm.
I remember I used this quote so much when I was applying, I think to medical school. It's a quote from Martin Luther King. It's I'm paraphrasing, but something like, I can't be who I ought to be unless you are who you ought to be. This idea that we are so dependent and interdependent on one another, right? And so knowing that any effort that I make on behalf of one patient will trickle down to the care she's able to give to her child, will trickle down to that child's ability to access education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so same thing in terms of the families that you're serving through fourth trimester. You might have a direct touch on one family, but that family will then make, a recommendation to another close friend or family member, and that will expand and expand until fourth trimester takes over the world. That's the
Mhm.
mission.
That's what I hope.
Yeah, and so no, and it goes down to back to, like, I think a foundational theme of fourth trimester, which is community.
Mhm.
All right, Rachel, I have a last couple questions for you. For any mom who's listening right now who feels invisible in the postpartum period, what do you want them to hear today?
You know, one that I come back to is I am worthy. I think
Mm,
hearing yourself say that, I am worthy, is one that's truly non-negotiable because if we don't
yeah.
think that, right, we're not able to ask for help. And I think that is actually something that is so unfortunately standard in our culture is to not ask for help as a woman, as a mother, right? And so one of the first things we did actually at fourth trimester when we were mom to mama was create a set of affirmation cards that were
Yeah.
bilingual. And there's 8 cards, and we would include them in postpartum care kits for moms just to have for themselves. And one of those cards was, I am worthy of health, happiness, and love. And I think if we can say, I
Mm,
am worthy, you are worthy, and you can trust your intuition, I think that's another one, is something that is so critical. It would be
yeah.
natural to say to a new mom who feels invisible, you are not alone. But I hope that what comes with intuition and as we model collective care is that that's actually not the first thing they have to hear because they know that it's that they are worthy and that
Mm.
that community of care is accessible and is there.
Yeah. Oh, that gives me chills. Yeah. As you're saying, I was like, that sounds perfect for an affirmation. And then lo and behold, you guys did make affirmation cards. You're
Yeah,
on it. You're on it. I
yeah.
love it. And we spent the past hour plus talking about systemic failures and the ways that our nation unfortunately does not show up adequately for birthers in the postpartum period, let alone their families. But I always want to end on a high note. And so what gives you hope? What makes you have faith and believe that change is possible?
Yeah, we need hope right now, right? I mean,
Mhm.
that's the
Yes, we
currency
do.
we're gonna live by
Yeah.
is hope at this moment. I think it's
Yes.
hard
Yes.
for so many to find it.
Yeah.
It's at a time where women's rights are being attacked. Women are dying at birth and around birth at an alarming rate in
Mhm.
our country, right? Made worse by recent policy changes and the dismantling of Roe v. Wade. And it's really heartbreaking to imagine newly postpartum people finding care in the current state of things, right? But yet,
Yeah.
I do
But
really
yet
feel hope. But yet, because I see people now that I've been in this field of work just 2 years, right? But in that, I've seen so many people fighting for change. And I would say, one program that is out of Flint, Michigan called RX Kids, this would be a
our
site for
kids.
hope, right? Provided $1,500 to moms during pregnancy and $500 a month
Mm.
after birth. And they reduced postpartum depression or reports of it by 14%. And
Beautiful.
premature births fell by 18%, right? So you can see that there is positive change happening with real work. People are studying this, people are storytelling around
Mhm.
positive outcomes. And I really feel that, hope is something that we choose. And I think if we can choose it in the organizations and providers, and we can build those bright spots and share those bright spots that are happening in the work that we're doing in our offices, in our communities together, I'm hopeful that there's enough of us that we'll see those trends turn into real change
Mm.
and to real policies. So I think when
Yeah.
I'm in it now and I see the people fighting for the work, I know that change is possible, and
Yeah.
that's what's giving me hope.
Yeah. No, change is going to come, and I am an eternal optimist, and so I will hold on to that hope with you. And you're right, there are times, as in currently, where it feels so daunting and dark, right? Oftentimes I subscribe to New York Times. Is oftentimes where I'm getting these New York Times alerts, and every alert is like, oh my god, another bombshell, another
Same.
huge, disappointing, disheartening moment for our country, let alone our world. And I think, hearing you, I was like, what if instead I could subscribe to some, good news, where you get like these updates on the many, many, many positive things that are happening, the many, many big wins that are happening, specifically within women's health and maternal health, right? I think, there are many things behind the idea of this podcast, but it is to speak hope into the world, to help bring women and birthers from those moments of isolation where they feel like they're the only ones experiencing said thing, to encourage storytelling, to encourage and push the status quo. And I think, Rachel, by golly, you and I did it. I think this conversation, it hit all of my personal goals. It's a really meaningful conversation to me. It's a really meaningful topic to me. I'm so grateful for all the incredible work that fourth trimester is already doing. And I have a sense that the sky is the limit, because that's what passion is. Well, that's what passion is capable of doing when your heart is really in the right place. So thank you, Rachel, for sharing that passion with us. And I can't wait to see what fourth trimester has in store next.
Thank you so much for the opportunity and for the work that you're doing in sharing stories. It's so critical. So thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to The Golden Hour, the podcast community where moms and moms-to-be can hear stories from other mothers and learn from top experts in pregnancy and postpartum care. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share with your friends so we can reach more people like you. You can visit goldenhour.fm for more information, resources, and all other episodes. If you have any requests, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, please email me at hello@goldenhour.fm or leave us a comment at goldenhour.fm on Instagram. Looking forward to seeing you in the next episode. Until then, stay golden.